Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for our fourth keynote of the conference, or the annual meeting. And I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Jan Hare. Dr. Hare is an Anishinaabe K scholar and educator from the Mi'kmaq First Nations located in Northern Ontario, Canada. She's a professor and dean pro tem in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. In addition, she holds the Canada Research Chair, Tier 1, in the Indigenous pedagogy. Her research is concerned with transforming educational institutions from early childhood, K-12 schooling, through to post-secondary education by centering Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies in teaching and learning. Her work has led to the development of a massive open online course, which is called Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education. This has been seen by over 70,000 people worldwide. Her current research explores the instructional practices of post-secondary educators, incorporating Indigenous knowledges and perspectives into higher education classrooms through collaborative inquiry. In addition, she's engaged in theorizing Indigenous-led teacher education through programs narrating their own story bundles. So without further ado, because we're running late, I turn you to Professor Hare.
Miigwech, Liz, you did very well, even though you practiced the language. So, Bojo, Ani, Janice Herdishnikas, Anishinaabe, Chiging, Anishinaabe, Endau, Chiging and Dojiba, Minowa, Tamagami, Anishinaabe, Musqueam, Aki, Ninda. So just a small greeting in my Anishinaabemowin language where I just introduced myself. And I want to begin by acknowledging the unceded lands of the Gananake Nation on whose lands Concordia University occupies. And while this acknowledgement is certainly a recognition of Indigenous peoples' long-standing presence on these lands, it is also a reminder of settler entanglements with colonialism. Education has been an instrument of colonialism, therefore complicit in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands, languages, and livelihoods. And so this land acknowledgement is an imperative for us then to recognize the foundational context of colonialism, shaping our disciplines as educators and researchers, and to challenge these legacies by fostering greater diversity of perspectives in our learning approaches and research methodologies. So I'm not sure who was here for yesterday's keynote, but put simply, it was just this smart and creative presentation. And I mean, there are just some acts I'm going to say that are hard to follow, the acts of pets, the acts of children, and now Nicole Rummel. So in preparation for today's talk, I'm going to say I'm approaching a very different kind of relationship, perhaps one that is a little more acrimonious. So if Indigenous ways of knowing saw learning sciences on a dating app, I'm going to say I'm not sure there'd be an immediate swipe right. That we saw in yesterday's marriage fields of study. We might actually have to be, and someone suggested that we might actually have to start more at the end in figuring out the compromises before the relationship even begins. So let me begin by suggesting to you in the friendliest way possible that the evolving proliferation of digital and network technologies is amounting for some of us to a colonial reassertion that Indigenous peoples and their knowledges are incompatible with modernity and progress, which is to say these are all-consuming technologies. And I say this I say this because I think the community gathered at this conference needs to recognize that Indigenous people are continuing to grapple with historically determined narratives that position them as technologically unsophisticated and that situate their culture and knowledges as static and perhaps only relevant in some quaint way to the past. As part of that, Indigenous people are too often regarded as anti-technological, as if their only concern was with maintaining their traditions in the face of Western notions of progress and advancement. And this is worse than being simply not true, as Julie Nagam, a historian of Indigenous arts, makes clear when she points to colonial projections of Indigenous timelessness and other myths of modernity as veiled attempts at limiting Indigenous futures, while presuming their inevitable assimilation and thus their disappearance. I am here today, however, to reassure you that Indigenous people have always been innovators across a vast array of technologies. For example, settler scholar David Gartner suggests cyberspace has always existed for Indigenous people. He writes, "Elders have always worlded through space-time travel," and he points to the wampum, and that's a wampum here, pictured here, which are beads made of shells that are then strung and woven together to communicate in ways that resemble what he says an early form of multidimensional hypertext. Interdisciplinary artist Cindy Leherandal has set out how Indigenous peoples' traditional data collection and documentary technologies have taken form in pictorial calendars, on bark, weaving, beadwork, quillwork, and other mnemonic devices. She explains how they work much like computer programs that transform source code into executable programs. I appreciate how she is able to offer a compelling counter story that recognizes what she describes as Indigenous pre-contact ingenuity as innovators and technologists, experts in new media and avatars of innovation. Or to turn to a scholar perhaps more familiar to this audience, Megan Bang and colleagues have advised scholars and educators to take seriously the ways in which Indigenous cultures mediate their relationships with, conceptions of, and innovations in technologies, recognizing that these relationships inform the subsequent implications for learning environments. Oh, sorry, I've got this thing. I like to talk with my hands. So for anyone who's ever taken my MOOC, you'll see me in all my videos like this. So I've got to be careful. So even as Indigenous people seek to redefine their relationship with digital and connected technologies on their own terms and for their own purposes, online environments are not neutral spaces. Comparing the myth of the Western frontier to that of a cyber frontier, a place thought to be boundless with endless horizons, unlimited opportunity, and open to settlement, McClure writes of the wild, wild web, claiming that cyberspace is vital to Western society's strategic interests, much in the same way as European colonial powers vied, and I would argue continue to vie, for the resources on Indigenous lands that they now occupy. The territorial expansion of the technological frontier she foresaw in 2000, would eventually follow the legacy of the European settlement as a, and I quote here, bleak legacy of despoiled natural environments, brutality towards Native people and minorities, vast differences in wealth and grinding poverty, personal failure, and misery. Colonial occupation of cyberspace was seemingly affirmed in the early metaphors of the internet as the information highway, as well as by popular applications of explorer, conqueror, and navigator. With the rise of computer-based technology, settler colonialism has seeped into the cyber realm. The internet has become another space and place where the violence and normalization of colonization are perpetuated, write Indigenous scholars Morford and Anslew. These authors point to how the internet operates as an extension of the colonial and Eurocentric world, developed through Western epistemologies, drawing our attention to the example of how contemporary platforms like Twitter, Facebook, I took TikTok out of the notes, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube mirror hegemonies of whiteness enacted on marginalized bodies, and that racism and sexism continue to be embedded within the algorithms of search engines. Efforts to represent Indigenous ways of knowing in online spaces are certainly fraught with intellectual, ethical, cultural, and technical challenges. For example, in order to honor Indigenous knowledge systems, there are protocols that have been developed by the custodians of this knowledge for transmitting, sharing, and reusing this knowledge, guided by community rituals, practices, privacy, and purpose. Yet, assumptions around open access and making Indigenous knowledge content open to all for people to do with what they will as some sort of de facto public good can threaten the integrity of Indigenous knowledges, resulting in misrepresentation or appropriation. Access and openness of Indigenous knowledges and content is much more complicated. It's much more complicated, nuanced, and conditional. And it's in fact a culturally determined and political act. Further, Indigenous knowledge must be understood in context. If Indigenous knowledge is captured in video, audio, or graphic forms and then is removed from context, then what we learn or come to understand can be incomplete or inaccurate. It is still far too common, for example, for Western libraries to continue to classify Indigenous knowledge as folklore. And perhaps I can explain at this point, when I speak of Indigenous ways of knowing, I'm referring to the locally and culturally specific knowledge derived from Indigenous peoples' long and multi-generational histories of interactions with the world around them, continually adapting to changing ecological and social conditions. Embodied in their lived experience, their ways of knowing encompass their beliefs, values, philosophies, and educational processes. Indigenous ways of knowing include learning processes that are intergenerational, relational, experience, conveyed in story and narrative, and tied to land and place. In previous work, I've argued that these Indigenous pedagogical practices are every bit as committed to meaning making as the practices associated with mainstream schooling, and that in fact form the basis on which to support Indigenous children's learning and skill development related to the expectations of schooling. Consider as well how Indigenous scholars, Batiste and Henderson, have described Indigenous knowledge as a complete knowledge system with its own epistemology, philosophy, and scientific and logical validity. As emerging digital technologies make for new types of access and modes of curating, viewing, listening, and displaying Indigenous knowledges, there are a growing number of settler scholars and Indigenous scholars and educators as well, who speak to the transformative potential of Indigenous knowledges in online learning spaces. By doing so, they are providing educators and researchers with reconfigurations of colonial practices that are more respectful, build from Indigenous engagement, and contribute to Indigenous priorities of reclamation, resurgence, self-determination, and sovereignty. For my part, I will be focusing a little later in this talk on my experiences with online teaching and learning in a manner that is inclusive of Indigenous knowledges. In particular, I will focus on a set of curriculum projects that demonstrate how Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies can be organized, mediated, and practiced within the online learning space to promote these ways of knowing, Indigenous histories and perspectives, and learning approaches. This is significant, not only because COVID-19 has increased interest in online learning and new platforms and technologies to assist us, but it takes on added importance here in Canada with policy shifts in K-12 and post-secondary education that have led to incorporating Indigenous content, perspectives, worldviews, and pedagogies into teaching and learning. This emphasis on inclusion of Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies reflects educational efforts to reconcile colonial histories and address Indigenous rights. And these efforts have resulted in major national statements and policies of great consequence, and that I think are worth mentioning here. And they include Indian control of Indian education in 1972, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, and in 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which issued not only findings, but 94 calls to action. And these calls to action really are intended to permeate every aspect of our society. Then on the international stage, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, part of which are now being implemented in Western Canada through a legal mechanism of a provincial act in British Columbia, and I believe it's the United Nations Declarations and Rights Act, which position Indigenous peoples as rights holders as opposed to stakeholders in decision making as it concerns education. According to Webb and Mashford-Pringle's Canadian policy analysis, in 5 out of the 10 provinces, that's BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, so those of you who are visiting from outside of Canada, get a sense of getting a tour here, as well as the Northwest Territories among the 3 territories in Canada, ministries of education now have policies in place that direct educators to include Indigenous content in their curriculum. Still working on Quebec here, Liz. Faculties of education among Canadian universities, specific course offerings, and the integration of Indigenous histories and perspectives and pedagogies continues to advance with mandatory coursework. As a result, discourses of reconciliation, decolonization, and more recently, indigenization are taking hold alongside discourses of multiculturalism, culturally responsive pedagogy, equity, and social justice, which, as settler scholar Lisa Taylor from Bishop's University tells us, have historically and predominantly shaped teacher education. My work, I'm going to say, is largely in teacher. While I serve as Dean Pro Tem, my work is largely in teacher education, so much of what I reference will be related to that. And I'm excited by the growing body of scholarship that is demonstrating how Indigenous people are continuing to recast online spaces for their own aspirations. They are engaged in using these technologies for community building, networking, language revitalization, restoring histories, preserving cultural practices, culturally organizing, protecting their rights, post-colonial strategies of survival and adaptation in the face of climate change, unsolved cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women, and unwanted and unlawful resource extraction on their lands. To take just one very encouraging example, consider Indigenous language revitalization. Anishinaabe scholar Amber Schilling is researching, like other scholars, how Indigenous youth are using technology to learn their language and culture. And she writes, there are many technology-based language learning tools available today. Many apps are downloadable at low or no cost on a wide variety of platforms. Website and blogs exist in increasing numbers that offer Indigenous language learning documents to anyone able to access the internet. One of the newer sites of engagement between technology and language in Indigenous communities is via social media, such as Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And sometimes I laugh because I think I think Facebook is really not a new tool, but Facebook is one that is really key in Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities really heavily rely on Facebook as a communication tool. Paul Megan traces the use of technology for Indigenous language revitalization initiatives, pointing to more recent initiatives including movies, gaming videos, song projects, the use of cell film and cell phones to document and record, and the growing number of Indigenous-led digital archives and content management systems emerging as a response to the colonizing effects of Indigenous knowledges. And I've been especially encouraged by the way online spaces and technologies are being taken up as a means to access and learn cultural knowledge and practices. I have seen firsthand the way Indigenous youth are taking to apps, YouTube and Facebook and others to learn community and cultural practices. For example, Indigenous beaters are utilizing Twitter to share, celebrate, and discuss beating traditions with other Indigenous beaters from all over Canada and other parts of the world. Extending their research on Twitter's unique technology, which includes word count, hashtags, and retweet functions, scholars Anne Luce and Morford have explored how Indigenous storytellers are crafting poetry, bite-sized teachings, bite-sized essays, and hypertextual relations to generate an emerging Indigenous literary genre. Blogs, YouTube, and Instagram or podcasts are sites of cultural learning, expression, and identity formation, particularly for young Indigenous people who are likely to be more familiar and comfortable with the spaces and technologies. For educators and researchers, there is such inspiration from the strategic and active creation of digital innovations that can contribute to the decolonization of online learning spaces, and not just to form the content or learning objectives, but as a means to amplify Indigenous voice, perspective, frameworks, and practices that can disrupt educational structures associated with colonization that include the curriculum, the course syllabi, resources, materials, and spaces of learning or assessment. But this is really only part of the decolonization project. Equally significant is a decolonizing approach that is accountable to Indigenous resurgence, reclamation, sovereignty, and futurity. Now, to demonstrate how one can engage with Indigenous ways of knowing in different educational settings, I will now turn to two curriculum projects in which I have had the privilege of participating. And the first is a collaborative and decolonizing curriculum design initiative for teacher education involving my colleagues Johanna Sam, Cynthia Nickel, and Leanne Petharek. The second curriculum the project that I'll speak to is the massive open online course that we mentioned at the beginning that I developed through UBC's Faculty of Education, and for which Concordia's Provost and Vice President Anne Whitlaw was kind enough to note yesterday at the start or opening of the conference. In the first project, given to revising teacher education courses, my role was to establish learning design principles that would assist instructors in decolonizing and indigenizing courses in math, physical health and well-being, science, inquiry, and psychology and special education. Rather than setting the Indigenous ways of knowing off on its own course, our goal was to infuse it through the subject areas in which these students would be teaching as a decolonization project in itself. This sort of change doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly calls for commitment and time. And so those involved, and I was very grateful for the time, but those involved in revisioning the courses met regularly over 2 years to discuss the design and implementation strategies and principles across the varied content areas. Instructors of courses also then met regularly as a collective to support one another once they began the teaching of the course, and then they were able to share and appraise the resources and activities and assessments and generating questions concerning cultural knowledge and the local context of the Indigenous teacher candidates. So these courses were originally transformed, if you will, revised for Indigenous teacher candidates. The faculty hosts a Indigenous teacher education program known as NITEP. And so we started with courses that would then, these courses that were delivered in the NITEP and then extended to the faculty's larger education program. So with the details in place, now let me set out the 4 Indigenous and decolonizing design principles that ended up guiding our process, while providing you with some examples of their application. And so the first principle was working from Indigenous knowledge frameworks. And so instructors in these courses were really encouraged to use Indigenous knowledge frameworks that can include conceptual and also visual representations that underlie Indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous knowledges and concepts and values are then integrated or structured to provide an understanding of the world around us. And these frameworks demonstrate the sophistication of Indigenous knowledge systems, which often face challenges of validity in their application to academic disciplines. And so there certainly are a growing number of Indigenous knowledge frameworks that assist with meaningful engagement of Indigenous theories and research. And here I refer to a few of them. There is Indigenous story work by Dr. Joanne Archibald, and she develops these 7 principles for engaging with Indigenous stories, both as method and also as a methodology. It's becoming a lot of our graduate students are using this methodology in their research, focusing on the principles that are listed here. They're thinking about the 4 R's by Verna Kirkness and Ray Barnhart, focusing on respect, reciprocity, relevance, and reverence. And so these are principles that they have developed for for higher education that are then being taken up and used in other educational spaces, and then also being defined in local context. Really interesting are the First Nations people's principles of learning. And so these are 8 principles that I would think of as Indigenous values and pedagogies that are quite common across Indigenous cultures. And so these are principles now that have been integrated into curriculum across all ages and all content areas of the provincial curriculum. And I mean, I could list more and more, but I just wanted to highlight a few of these. And so we drew on numerous frameworks, introducing the instructors to these frameworks, helping them to think through how they're organized, the meaning that they construct, how they then could be integrated into their own planning. And this is one example of Dr. Cynthia Nicol, who revised her math course then based on these principles, and then it sort of came to her own framework. And so this approach helped her to overcome the add and stir model of multiculturalism. And so rather than start with her scope and sequence for the course, which was really challenging, I think, for her and some of the other instructors, starting with the scope and sequence, rather than starting with scope and sequence in terms of the content, she really diverted from what we think of as traditional planning of curriculum. Instead, she focused on themes and wove her course content throughout. And these are just a few of the other principles that we drew on. So through indigenizing design, though Indigenous design is attentive to diversity in languages and traditions and practices among Indigenous people, there are certainly common elements of Indigenous cultures that were considered in adapting the mainstream teacher education curriculum to Indigenous content or context. So, for example, there are common values and pedagogies, as I was saying, among Indigenous people that include oral tradition, intergenerational approaches to learning, land and experiential learning, and relationality and interconnectedness. Indigenous scholarship assisted these instructors to be inclusive of the broader values and pedagogies for this indigenizing process, drawing on the scholars, educators, and authors and artists then to contribute to really a broad range of perspectives in the course design. However, responding to local context really required the instructors then to consult and collaborate with local community members that included knowledge keepers and as well as the students themselves. So asking Indigenous knowledge keepers and community members for their input in the course design really resulted in richer and fulsome experiences for both students and instructors. And this is because they were able to provide local stories, share cultural practices. They had knowledge of the land and the land markers, place names, plants, medicines, and as well, interactions of students with community and family members and practicing educators really amplified the local aspects in the instructional design. And so while many of the instructors were sensitive to Indigenous protocols, they were then assisted with community members and the students themselves. In online spaces, they also took advantage of multimodal forms that foregrounded Indigenous voice and Indigenous-led, as well as Indigenous-created digital collaborations. We found that digital storytelling and engaging in Indigenous teacher candidates in the process of digital storing really was an important mode of expression and pedagogy for them, as they were able to tell their own stories, document and generate and archive their own histories and their own truths, as well as contemporary realities. One of the projects, a student produced a podcast that focused on a very significant area in their territories, which is the Highway of Tears. And it's the highway where a disproportionately large number of Indigenous women have gone missing. And so she was really able to tell this story from her own perspective. Multimodality in course design enabled teacher candidates then to share historical and contemporary visual expressions, as I say, listen to podcasts, take part in traditional activities, of the community, which were drumming, songs, rattle making, preparing traditional foods, and learning about the medicines. And then they would document these and share them in different kinds of ways. Relationality configures strongly within Indigenous worldview, and this includes relationships with one another, to the family and community, ancestors, and to the land. Instructors place significance on fostering and sustaining these relationships as a pedagogical principle. So despite being geographically dispersed, online learning can still create opportunities for holistic connections among learners. Reedy found a focus on design creation and facilitation of online spaces that prioritizes the relational nature of learning appealed to Indigenous students. This also involved relationships with instructors, where strong instructor presence online enhanced Indigenous students' feelings of connection, especially when the teacher exhibited Indigenous cultural awareness, such as taking flexible approaches to assessment timeframes to enable students to balance their studies with their family and community obligations. It is important in the indigenizing design that the teacher instructors ensured ample opportunities for all students to make interpersonal connections and provide purposeful tools and spaces and pedagogies to facilitate these interactions, as well as taking these relationships offline to offline spaces in their application. So in the physical education course that was taught online, the course originally I think started at 9 or something in the morning. The instructor gave instructions for half hour in which students had tasks to be out in the land, on the community, taking part in different kinds of activities, and then they would bring back and apply and share what they had been doing. For instructors, an indigenizing approach to online learning also emphasize these relationships to land. Place-based conceptualizations within digital spaces can occur through different mediums, such as messaging apps, Facebook, and some of the others I've mentioned earlier. Morford and Anslus analyze social media environments to examine Indigenous conceptions of land in these spaces. With a focus on Twitter, these authors tell us that, quote, tweets become a way of digitally rematriating settler-occupied lands, asserting and reclaiming them as Indigenous lands imbued with spirituality, knowledges, and relationality. And so really trying to disrupt for the instructors that land and land-based learning could occur in the online space. And these spaces are living spaces where land and place relationships can be developed for students. A second project I want to share is the design and development and some of the research associated with the MOOC that was introduced. As part of the reconciliation movement in Canada and in other countries, I developed this free online professional development tool for educators. And it was intended to be in line with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation calls to action to address the legacies of colonial schooling. And so really what I wanted educators to do was, and I feel like I've broken the PowerPoint rules here of too much text and a lot going on here, but I really wanted educators to deepen their knowledge of Canada's colonial history and how an assimilationist education has produced different outcomes for Indigenous learners in comparison to their non-Indigenous counterparts. I wanted teachers to interrogate their own personal and professional positionings, to understand how they are implicated in colonial systems of education, to recognize and advance Indigenous knowledges in teaching and learning, and to reveal that their relationship to the land is another entanglement in settler colonialism, and finally develop strategies for respectful engagement with Indigenous families and communities. And I've learned since that these are very lofty, ambitious goals to work with. And I hope that the MOOC would contribute to the much-needed transformation in K-12 and post-secondary education. However, like other scholars and educators, I have become impatient towards reconciliation, but that is another presentation for another time. Similar to the first curriculum project, I drew on Indigenous theory and education, as well as MOOC-related scholarship, in which I found to be depressing, if you will, in organizing, but, as it focuses on how to plan and design a MOOC. But I did turn to Indigenous educators and community members and ally settler educators, really to provide guidance. I then developed a community-based advisory. It was, to help guide and ensure the relevance of this MOOC. And as I said, I took seriously the critiques of MOOCs as lecture-centered, recorded teaching, slow-paced didactic learning with chaotic floods of information, or simply maybe not enough and too much structure, and sometimes not enough structure, and certainly the lack of flexibility in the platform and the assignments through grading. And so I did find support from Cambridge African scholar Sakine Adam, who points to coloniality embedded in dominant MOOC platforms, suggesting MOOCs not only need to cater to difference in their conceptualization of learners in terms of geographic and infrastructure context, but also create room for the inclusion of different ways of thinking, knowing, and being. So there's 6 units in the MOOC, and you can see them up here, and they work through 6 weeks. We were very deliberate about not just opening it. We only opened the course 3 times a year. We released, released each week separately and with an announcement. And this was, I think, originally really to control some of the narrative that we were, and some of the discussion boards and what we were observing in terms of people's resistance or the kinds of discomfort, I think, and unsettling that comes with the unlearning perhaps that they were experiencing. But integrated across these themes were the following. We used critical pedagogies intended to help participants learn and unlearn what they know and understand about Indigenous settler relationships, reflecting on their own positionalities. And we used Indigenous pedagogical practices that really allowed them to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing, with the goal towards these epistemic shifts in one's knowledge and the way they think about knowledge, what counts as knowledge, how knowledge is transmitted, and then also decolonizing assessments. We used decolonizing assessments across, or tried to decolonize our assessments using self and peer assessments, using more of rubrics. So there was no grading in the course, but using rubrics that help people then to move ahead their thinking. Using recursive learning strategies, we had a few tests whereby, they a multiple choice, but if they didn't get it right, it explained why the answer was incorrect, and then allowed them then to participate again, move on, try their answer again, until then they were able to come to the correct answer in it. And then also narrative, using forms of narrative to document and reflect on their experience. So given our time remaining, I'm going to, I know there's a big black hole here. There's the video I was hoping to show, but I want to be mindful of time. But given our time remaining, I'm going to focus on just one of the themes and unit of the course, and that was land education, with a few examples of how Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies were then given expression in this topic. I'll then turn to participant reflections on their experience, and this is where we are doing some research as they answered a set of prompts when they concluded the course. Their completion of prompts concerning Indigenous pedagogies and ways of knowing situated within the course demonstrated really a change in their awareness of Indigenous knowledges and even challenged their own worldviews, but really lacked, I'm going to say, deeper engagement or even nuanced understandings of Indigenous knowledges in their application to teaching and learning. Now, because land is central to any discussions regarding decolonization, reconciliation, and sovereignty, as we contemplate contemporary Indigenous settler relationships, the MOOC, we used a land education approach advocated by Eve Tuck, Marcia McKenzie, and a colleague, begins with an M, but her last name is McCoy. And so this approach is distinguished from forms of place-based learning, as land education aims to disrupt settler histories and identities, while at the same time drawing on Indigenous knowledge from across human and other than human worlds. And I don't have time today, but I would have showed you an example here of intergenerational learning. We have a video here of so all of the units start with elders and knowledge keepers who really set a cultural context for the theme. This one would have starts with land education starts with Elder Larry Grant, and he tells the Musqueam origin story. He talks about how Indigenous languages and the way they are embedded with land. He talks about encroachment, colonial encroachment in an area, and the kinds of restoration that they're working towards. And he tells these all through different forms of stories. And each unit then concludes, or each unit concludes, with various youth voices, voice and perspective. So we were able to interview some youth. We drew on, this is just a beautiful website, and I'm sure many of you working with young people who are producing materials in class just see the beauty and the creativity of what comes together. And so we used some of these videos by Nuan Jinan, which is Coming Home in Cree. And this is a group, an organization that takes these mobile recording studio to various First Nations reserves, communities across Canada, and works within the schools for young people then to produce their own videos that really reflect on their own experiences in community, that focus on their identity, reclamation of language, matters that are of significance and priority to them. And this is one about land. And so what we do is we position, there's a juxtaposition of these two videos or two experiences, and then in discussions and reflections, we ask the participants then to reflect on these. So I realize I'm not going to have time to share those. So here we go. I do want to give some time to share participant experiences of the course to show how participants engage and experience Indigenous ways of knowing in the MOOC. And these are selected responses. What we've done is we pulled out those who identified as educators working in either early childhood, K to 12, or post-secondary, and who identify as non-Indigenous, and these were the categories within the platform of the MOOC. And so overall, what we saw, and I'm just sharing a few of these, but overall, we see how this group of participants consistently express developing and enhancing their awareness of Indigenous ways of knowing. And we had different prompts in kind of thematic categories. We had some different prompts for them to respond to. And one was, really what stood out for me in this particular area. And so we see that they really were able to expand their capacities, if you will, to understand Indigenous knowledges more broadly. And these are quotes that are specific to land-based knowledge. So they're seeing some of the values and beliefs and perspectives that are held within an Indigenous worldview. And so but there were also certainly numerous participants who were really challenged, and they were able to develop their own worldviews were challenged, but they were really able to develop a deeper respect for Indigenous ways of knowing. And this is just one of the comments I draw on. I like to juxtapose it against this picture. This is an exhibition on our campus by Edward Heapabirds, and it really is, you can see British Columbia is backwards. It's a way to really disrupt our ideas and understandings of what it means to be on Indigenous lands. And of course, there's a lot of other comments, but I just really wanted to take a moment to share at least one that suggested the ways in which they were starting to counter their own worldviews and understandings. And even as they acquired new understandings of values, beliefs, and practices associated with Indigenous worldviews and their epistemological standpoints were challenged, the majority of responses suggest really limited ways of applying this knowledge. And so these are just some comments whereby, and there's certainly lots more, where they just talked about, I'll go outside. I hadn't thought about being outside. I'll take learning outside, or I'll start to read more Indigenous literatures, but not, stories are circular. I'm going to learn some Indigenous stories. So I'm almost, are you giving me a time? Am I getting the 5 minutes? Okay, I'm getting the 8 minutes, okay. So I'm gonna close here then. And so these projects certainly demonstrate that Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies provide a basis on which to build robust and meaningful and relational opportunities for teaching and learning in online spaces for all students. But also the lessons learned here today can certainly be applied to face-to-face teaching. And I share here that I'm moving ahead with another MOOC, and really wanted to emphasize that as we move forward with this next MOOC, how it is that we can dig deeper, if you will, into really unsettling, I think, some of the student experience in the course. At the start of this conference, and I do want to return to the start, at the start of this conference, Henry Giroux gave us a number, he gave us a number of strategies in which education might stand against the rise of fascism. And among those ideas, he posed an alternative future, one based on hope. And in that spirit, I'm here to tell you that not only is another world possible, to borrow the phrase, but that another world, another way of knowing and being has proven itself already here on these lands, Indigenous lands. Indigenous people have not just survived, but have thrived on these lands against acts of colonialism in what I'd call evidence-based living. And what we need now, I'd like to suggest in closing, is a possible future that builds on relations with Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing, including relationships with the land, as we addressed society's most pressing issues, including climate change, food security, mental health, and well-being. And I invite you to join me and many others who are working to realize not just Indigenous futures, but a future for all of us. Miigwech. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. A couple of questions.
We have time for some questions, so.
Oh. Okay, I've just moved into the stage of progressives or transitions. I don't know what they're called, but I've just moved into the stage, so now I can see others.
Hi, Jan.
Hi, hello.
I'm really glad
Honey.
to meet you because I'm teaching one of your students this summer.
Oh, terrific.
So I was really curious if you have any thoughts about any similarities or, importantly, differences between designing these online environments specifically for an Indigenous student colleague versus a non-Indigenous or more general student body.
I wouldn't think of that as different. I mean, I think really at the core of this is wanting to amplify Indigenous perspectives within the space. I think at core or really important to that is, how this work then and how we work with students, to challenge. And maybe that is the difference when we think about critical pedagogies, right? And so when we're designing, probably when I think about designing for non-Indigenous students in our faculty, we do work more through, just looking at their positionalities, looking at what they know about Indigenous people, what have they come to know, how have they come to know, what has shaped their thinking, what investments they have in that thinking, who's helped by that thinking, who's hurt by that thinking, right? So I think that's one of the key differences in terms of designing for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And really Indigenous students, these can be like, having their lives and identities validated in these kinds of resources. These are spaces that really can become places of connection and of love and safety, for students when we can bring in these perspectives and then mediate that space. But I would say that's probably the key difference in that kind of design.
Yes, thank you so much for, I don't know what to call it. I'm a very, I don't have the words to say it. Maybe I have it in my language, but I don't have the English words to say, but provocative way of looking at things. I'm just asking myself, because I like it that the digitalization is opening us a way of bringing forth these things that we call Indigenous. But I'm asking myself, where do you think we should begin? Because on one hand, we are saying that these Indigenous ways of knowing, I think it's what we need. I think I agree with it's what we need because it's focusing on relationship. It's focusing on our relationship with the land. We all live on land, and we are all Indigenous to some place, I believe, even though some of us maybe were excluded at one time. But I'm asking myself, if we are going to make this move forward, to start designing for difference, but also bringing forward these issues about resilience and valuing ourselves and valuing our relationships with each other, where do you think we should start?
I guess in my work, I start with Indigenous community, and I think of Indigenous community quite broadly. So working in collaboration, in partnership, in consultation, in guidance, and so working with Indigenous people to understand, what are their priorities, what are their interests, what is appropriate in these spaces to share, what's not appropriate. On the MOOC, for example, each of the units start with elders talking about cultural knowledge, sharing their teachings, sharing their histories and experiences. And with that, we have people who, and we used YouTube as a platform, and then we had to put a lock on so nobody could download the videos. And we had constant, just barrage of emails of people saying, "Oh, can we download? That's one of the videos we would like to see. Can we download it?" Or I mean, they could see it on the course, but they'd want to download it for future use, and we'd have to have, we have a caveat there that says, this is videos only given to us or for use within the MOOC. Well, of course, we know that people can screen capture and other ways of accessing the videos, but we really tried to follow protocol. So again, it's working with community, I think, to guide that work. So I say that's where to start in this kind of work, in this kind of development work. So. When I think about this is largely, the emphasis of reconciliation attracts largely non-Indigenous folks to the MOOC. So yes, I do think that that we would want these, create these opportunities for non-Indigenous people then to participate, learn from. But I think it also comes with developing a broader context for resources and knowledge that we share. I work with students who, and I love now that teacher candidates are saying, "Hey, can I do this in my classroom? Like, could I make a dream catcher in the classroom? Or could I make this cultural object in the classroom?" And I always say to them, if you cannot uphold the sacred, don't do it. And so they'll say, "Well, what do you mean? What do you mean by the sacred?" And I'm saying, well, do you know the nations from which this artifact comes from? Do you know the history and perspectives of this? Do you know the resource? Do you know the land? Do you know the languages? Do you know how this is used? Have you considered inviting somebody Indigenous into the space to help you guide this? And as I say, June makes me very nervous all the time. In Canada, it's Aboriginal History Month. It's Indigenous Peoples Day on the 21st. And so that's when we have a lot of educators, choosing to make button blankets or choosing to make totem poles, oh dear, out of toilet paper rolls, and really, so trying to discourage that. But I really do. I think that embedded in these artifacts are, I'm going to say, sacred kinds of laws, right? And so we need to help learners, participants, understand that there's a broader context to this knowledge.
I want to say great presentation, and thank you for sharing your stories and all the work that you're doing for this community. As a student of two Indigenous parents who immigrated from South America, Ecuador, to here, I want to ask, what can I do personally to kind of grow that community? I saw that you recommended digital recommendations and things like that. And then also I want to ask, what can we do academically to kind of promote that in this learning sciences community as well?
I guess I really encourage working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. Much of the research that I do, so for example, I'm working on a project. I'm not answering your questions directly. I'm just telling you some stories. Is generally how, it's kind of a feature of Indigenous storytelling. But I'm working on a digital. Liz mentioned a digital story bundle project. And I really want to look at the way Indigenous teacher education programs are situated in mainstream teacher education in ways that they are strategically resisting, but also perhaps working with the discourses of teacher education in ways those discourses actually maybe subvert or work against sovereignty for Indigenous people, and really doing that through what's important to them, right? So working with them about what kinds of questions do I need to be asking in this research? What are the kinds of methodologies then that would be, appropriate, respectful, relevant right? So it's about making research relevant to the very people that this research is intended to serve, right? So it is engaging with folks. And I've been in research contexts where someone said, don't do that. You know, don't do that. And I'm like, oh, okay, you know, can you help me to understand? And so just really working with Indigenous people and their priorities, really, you know, working alongside, you know, building their capacity as well. So building community capacity, not only to understand research, but engage in their own research, having them be part of the analysis is just so interesting as well when they take part and help interpret things that, you know, we wouldn't think of, or again, build that context for us as researchers. You know, working with communities who, you know, and many communities will have their own protocols. So protocols for research in terms of the kinds of agreements, what you can do as research, seeking permission. Increasingly, Indigenous communities they may have advisories or boards in which then you have to work with, you know, to be able to do that work. But I say it's relationship. It is about building those relationships. And we all know, right, in our research, when we build really good relationships, you know, the experience can be quite, you know, can be quite fulsome, can be quite revealing, can be quite impactful. And so sometimes it's really taking that time. And we see for Indigenous scholars who often are, you know, who take a lot of time to build relationships with community. And then when they go up for promotion and tenure, that becomes something that's not recognized because they haven't produced enough, they haven't written enough, they've, you know, why is it, you know, that grant was only a 3-year SHIRK project, it's now turned into 5, you know, having those extensions, because people really don't understand what's involved in developing those kinds of relationships. And they take time. It takes time to build trusting relationships in the face of traditions, research traditions that have really been very detrimental to Indigenous peoples. And so I really think relationship is just really key to that, and taking the time to build those relationships. Oh, Paula's giving me the cue.
I think on that note, we'll thank Jan again for this amazing talk.
Thank you very much. And Miigwech, thank you. Thank you for the great questions.